Beyond Duality, Defining and Measuring Poverty. In this presentation, Harris and I will present our own unique definition and system of measurement regarding the issue of poverty in society. To do this, we will break our presentation into two parts. How do we define poverty, and how do we measure poverty? We hope that this presentation acts as a catalyst for further discourse regarding poverty in America and human society as a whole. Let's begin. To a majority of people, poverty is resource deprivation, or the lack of things such as food and shelter, or income deprivation, which is the lack of substantial funds to live well. In defining poverty, there are a few questions that we ask. If poverty is a lack of essential resources, which resources qualify as essential? If poverty is an issue of income deprivation, what is the minimum income someone needs to live without poverty? If poverty is the result of one's environment, how do we define which environments are conducive to poverty? And if poverty is an issue of persistence from father to son, how do we pinpoint its cause? Scholars well acquainted with the subject have endeavored to define poverty. John Iceland defines poverty as referring to economic or income deprivation. Amartya Sen defines poverty as not a matter of low well-being, but of the inability to pursue well-being because of a lack of economic means. And Robert Rector's implicit definition is that poverty is defined as material deprivation and the lack of funds to fulfill sufficient needs. In creating a poverty definition, we must create a definition that accounts for all aspects of poverty, addresses all questions, and provides enough generalizations so that no one is excluded. It's a tall order, but with careful consideration, we've defined poverty as this. Poverty, a state of being in which a person lacks full agency to obtain those certain resources or realize those certain circumstances that qualify a dignified existence. What does this mean? To better understand it, we will break it down. A state of being. This is not a complete life, but a present reality. It's the here and now, not an absolute characterization of life in its entirety. Poverty is a fluctuating condition. Certain factors can put people above or below the poverty line, or other places on the poverty scale, depending on the financial season they're in. A person. In this definition, we have decided to define a person as any human being, regardless of background, education, mental health, mental faculty, or physical ability. Lacks full agency. Agency is not black and white. It is possible to achieve some measure of a thing without achieving or obtaining it in its entirety. Full does not refer to the best care or resources money can buy, not the best car or the best service. Rather, it refers to the uninhibited freedom to pursue. If a person lacks full agency, they do not have this freedom. Agency. Central to agency are functionings, parts of the state of a person, in particular the various things that he or she manages to do or be in leading a life. These are the doings and beings of a person. Also central to agency are capabilities, which reflect the alternative combinations of functionings a person can achieve. Capabilities are contingent on the existence of functionings. Simply, capabilities reflect a person's ability to achieve functionings. We are taking a capabilities approach to poverty. This focuses on the ability of an individual to achieve or obtain the components of well-being rather than the components themselves. For example, imagine that in order to live well, one must own 4 rubber ducks. To have 4 is to live comfortably. To have any less means you are impoverished. A capabilities approach focuses not on the functionings, aka the rubber ducks themselves, but on a person's ability to obtain them. Does the person have transportation to the rubber duck store to get them? Do they have a job that gives them income to purchase the ducks? Do they have the education needed to hold a job to make the income to afford the rubber ducks? In short, agency refers to an individual's capability. Obtain and realize. Both of these refer to the achievement of functionings. Achievements are the subject of capabilities. It is not enough to consider a person's achievements of functionings when considering poverty. The person's ability to achieve must be considered above all. Those certain resources in those certain circumstances. Those certain are those things widely acknowledged as being central to well-being, relative to the greater non-impoverished population. Resources include the basic necessities of life, often referred to as FCSU needs. These are food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, and sometimes added on, healthcare and education. Capabilities also play a factor. According to Martha Nussbaum, there are 10 capabilities that are central to human dignity. These are life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment. Qualify. This refers to the possession of FCSU needs and the 10 central capabilities, which, when possessed at minimum, define a person's poverty status. Examples of this include utilities, food, shelter, control over one's environment, practical thought, or life. These are the most commonly recognized bases for the qualification of a dignified existence, and they will be revisited in the measurement section. A dignified existence. Dignity is based in freedom of choice. This includes allowing those with the capabilities to achieve certain functionings, but who choose not to use them, continue to do so. There is an emphasis on treating human beings as human beings. A dignified existence is defined primarily by the individual experiencing it, or lack of it, and defined secondarily by society in a relative way. Furthermore, there is a danger in treating impoverished people as saints as well as sinners. It is just as dehumanizing to treat all impoverished people as completely blameless as it is to assign all the blame to them. To do so removes an aspect of humanity, that is, the freedom of choice. Conclusions. In our definition of poverty, there is a focus on agency or capabilities, not actual ownership or realization of functionings, and dignity, that is the freedom of choice, which is ever-changing and relative to the greater, non-impoverished population. Next, we will address measurement.
How do we measure poverty? First, we should look over the types of measurements. First, there's an absolute measure, which is how much do you have. And there's a relative measure, which is how much do you have compared to everyone else. There are quantitative measurements, a measure which is rooted in numbers and can be compared to other values. And there's a discursive measure, which stems from discourse and conversation about a situation. The United States uses the official poverty measure. The OPM looks at household income before taxes and sets a poverty threshold that is 3 times a food basket the census believes will be adequate to feed a family. Thresholds are adjusted for inflation and family composition. What are the pros of the OPM? Both the threshold and the household status are relatively easy to compute, and it establishes a simple duality where people are defined as impoverished or not impoverished, so there's no gray area. There are some shortcomings of the OPM, however. For one, it's outdated, so it doesn't factor in-kind benefits such as food stamps or any other type of aid that comes in the kind of aid that you're getting. There's also near-cash benefits like the EITC that doesn't get covered. There's non-discretionary expenses like daycare and travel costs that are not roped into this. It also doesn't account for a non-traditional household that's not a regular nuclear family with married parents. It also has a simplistic way of determining the threshold, which is the 3 times a food basket, which has changed a lot over the years. It also doesn't address the differences in cost living in different areas. There are alternatives to the OPM. The one the U.S. also uses or looks at is the supplemental poverty measure. It looks at FCU spending instead of income. That's food, clothing, shelter, and utility. It also accounts for most of the benefits that the OPM leaves out. The poverty line is set relative to society. It's 33% of median income times 1.2 for spending recreationally. The pros of the SPM is it accounts for geographical differences, unlike the OPM. It also treats households as all individuals living under a roof. It looks at the expenses of families holistically. The cons of the SPM are that it's very complicated and hopeful. It's a binary system, so there's still only black and white. There's no middle ground. And there's reporting issues. There's a possibility that people can abuse it and throw off the values. And it may be seemingly too expensive because there's a lot of money that needs to be spent to collect and analyze the data. It also doesn't factor in quality of life, the central capabilities that were discussed earlier in the presentation. Now we come to how we think we should measure poverty. We believe it should capture material needs, such as food, clothing, shelter, and utility, plus health and education, things you cannot live without. The SPM covers most of these, but it falls short because it doesn't look at the central capabilities. We think that living a dignified life is more than having enough to get by. You need to actually think you're fulfilling something. There are also difficulties factoring in capabilities into the measure. It's hard to quantify one in relation to another. How much more would you value bodily integrity than play? It's also quantifying uses the assumption that having an excess of one capability and lacking in another is the same as having adequate levels of both. Our proposal is an amended SPM. It's based off the SPM in that it looks at food, clothing, shelter, utilities, health, and education, because material resources are important. It also includes a geographic capabilities factor. Since getting in individual cases would be too costly, we can look at communities. What would the geographic capabilities factor look like is that it would account for capabilities of communities by using variables that model specific capabilities, such as life expectancy to measure life, average ER wait time or number of hospitals to measure bodily health, crime rates to measure bodily integrity in the area, and some form of educational quality to measure sense, imagination, thought, emotions, and practical reason, and affiliation. We also want to stress the importance of a distribution. A hard poverty line doesn't tell much about how the people are doing. We want to set multiple thresholds as well as release descriptive statistics of the entire distribution to show how people are doing, and more importantly, how many people are in certain states. We also want to release measures relating to how people within the distribution move over time. There are, however, some downsides to our measure. It's incredibly hopeful and may oversimplify the problems of poverty. It also will require a lot of manipulation to get accurate results. And it lacks a discursive aspect, which would be really helpful, but in terms of finding a measure that you can release, it's kind of hard to include a discursive aspect. And it requires a lot of time and data collection, which would be a problem. But we still think our measure would be better, because it treats people as more than just numbers. It also takes into account the needs based on the capabilities approach to make sure they're living a dignified life. And it shows the actual activity of the economy as well as the quality of life. Though it's not perfect, it has the potential to be a lot better than the current measures, and that's why we think we should use it. I hope this presentation proved insightful to teach you about poverty, how it is defined and how it's measured, and hopefully gave you a little insight into how we could better treat poverty and tackle it.